What happens when a college professor tries to make an example out of a quiet student, only to discover she just challenged a once-in-a-generation genius? In today's gripping story, meet Ethan Marshall, a reserved math prodigy with an IQ of 170, who finds himself publicly singled out during a lecture that was supposed to be about calculus, but quickly turns political. Dr. Karen Ellison, known for her strong ideological stance, accuses Ethan of succeeding purely due to privilege. To prove her point, she writes an impossible equation on the board, one even graduate students would fear. But what she doesn't realize is that Ethan reads original mathematical texts in German, and what happens next stuns the entire class. He doesn't just solve the problem, he transforms the way the class sees math, respect, and truth itself. You'll want to stick around until the end to see how a simple act of humility rewrites the power dynamic of an entire university. Like, comment, and subscribe for more powerful true-to-life stories like this one. Dr. Karen Ellison's lecture hall had always carried a reputation. Not just for its challenging calculus problems, but for the professor's tendency to blend math with her outspoken political views. That morning, however, felt different. As students filed in and took their seats, they noticed something unusual: there were no equations written on the whiteboard. Instead, a single bold phrase stared back at them, redefining academic priorities. A hush fell over the room. Without even introducing the day's topic, Dr. Ellison began a presentation on systemic inequality, specifically gender and racial disparities in STEM fields. She projected graphs and statistics onto the screen, her voice heavy with emotion and conviction. She argued that too many students achieved success not through effort, but through privilege, often racial, often inherited. Some of you, she said, scanning the room, didn't have to work as hard to get here. Some doors were already open for you. Her words carried weight, and for a moment, the class listened in silence. But then her eyes landed on a student in the back row, Ethan Marshall. A tall, quiet young man who rarely spoke, Ethan had built a reputation for solving problems others couldn't. But unlike his peers, he didn't seek attention. What most didn't know was that Ethan had been raised by his grandmother in rural Ohio, often doing his homework by flashlight during frequent power outages. He wasn't born into wealth or status, he was born into hardship. Still, to Dr. Ellison, Ethan represented something else. A young white man who seemed to excel effortlessly. A symbol, in her mind, of systemic advantage. So, with the class watching, she singled him out. "Ethan," she said, her tone sharp and unmistakably targeted, "do you believe you're here because you worked harder than everyone else? Or did your background carry you here?" A few students turned in their seats. Some looked uncomfortable. Ethan, however, didn't flinch. He simply stared back, calm and collected. He didn't answer right away, because he was thinking. Not about himself, but about the trap he had just been placed in. This moment wasn't about math. It was about race, bias, and judgment. Dr. Ellison didn't know Ethan's story. She didn't know that the only reason he'd even made it to college was because of scholarships, or that he'd spent his high school years tutoring students of all backgrounds in his community center, advocating for those without access to quality education. By assuming Ethan's story based on how he looked, Dr. Ellison had made a critical error, a form of profiling, wrapped in academic language. In trying to fight discrimination, she had accidentally perpetuated it. And Ethan? He was about to show her, and the entire class, the danger of judging someone not by their actions or character, but by their appearance. The room held its breath. Ethan Marshall didn't respond immediately. Not because he was intimidated, but because he knew exactly what was happening. He was being judged not by his work, not by his ideas, but by the way he looked. A quiet white student with exceptional ability. In Dr. Ellison's narrative, that could only mean one thing: unearned privilege. And no one had bothered to ask where he'd come from, what he'd overcome, or what battles he still fought outside those classroom walls. Dr. Ellison didn't stop there. She folded her arms and, with a voice dripping with implication, said, "Why don't we see if privilege can solve this?" Then, turning to the board, she began writing a monstrously complex equation, pages of it, stretching from one side to the next. It wasn't part of the curriculum. In fact, many students recognized it for what it was, a research-level problem designed to humiliate, not educate. She capped the marker with a satisfied click and turned back to Ethan. "If mathematics is impartial," she said, "prove it." Her challenge wasn't just academic. It was personal. And racial undertones lurked beneath the surface. She had crafted a moment designed to tear Ethan down not because of what he had done, but because of what he represented to her. And that's what made the scene so unsettling. In trying to fight historical injustice, Dr. Ellison had crossed a line, one where prejudice was repackaged in the name of justice. Several students shifted uncomfortably. A few, especially students of color who had studied with Ethan in the library or seen him volunteer as a tutor on campus, began whispering to one another. They knew him. They knew his story. And they could feel that this wasn't just about race, it was about power. Ethan rose from his seat slowly. His movements were calm, but his presence suddenly felt enormous. Without a word, he walked to the whiteboard. He studied the problem briefly, his eyes scanning the long series of calculations, and then, without hesitation, picked up the marker and began to write. But instead of solving the equation in the traditional way, he took an unconventional route, one based on obscure 18th-century methods rarely taught in modern classrooms. He cited original German texts, scribbled not just formulas, but brief explanations, ensuring every step could be understood. Students leaned forward, eyes wide, not because they were watching a show, but because they were learning. In that moment, Ethan dismantled every assumption Dr. Ellison had made. Not with anger. Not with arrogance. But with clarity, logic, and grace. As the board filled with elegant, clean solutions, a subtle shift passed through the room. The narrative Dr. Ellison had tried to impose was unraveling, not just because she had misjudged Ethan, but because she had reduced a complex human being into a stereotype based on race. And Ethan? He was just getting started. As Ethan's marker glided across the board with calm precision, a quiet storm was brewing, not outside the classroom, but within it. The equation that Dr. Ellison had weaponized was now being unraveled line by the very student she had tried to discredit. The irony hung heavy in the air. She had meant to make a statement about racial and systemic privilege, but instead, she had exposed a deeper, more uncomfortable truth, that prejudice, even when cloaked in noble intentions, is still prejudice. Ethan's every movement stood in stark contrast to the tone Dr. Ellison had set. Where she was confrontational, he was composed. Where she had tried to shame, he chose to teach. He wasn't just solving the problem, he was guiding the entire class through it, making something once intimidating feel approachable. Even students who usually struggled with advanced calculus began to follow along, nodding, whispering to one another, "I actually get this." And still, Dr. Ellison said nothing. She stood by the podium, arms crossed, jaw tight. Her silence was louder than words. The more Ethan wrote, the more uncomfortable she became. Not because he was wrong, but because he was right. And worse, because he was defying every assumption she had made about him. To her, he was a symbol of systemic advantage, a reminder of everything she believed was wrong with the academic world. But what she hadn't seen, or refused to see, was that Ethan had never acted superior, never claimed special treatment. His success came not from status, but from perseverance and raw ability. Still, for Dr. Ellison, admitting that meant letting go of a deeply held narrative. One she had used not only to justify her teaching methods, but to define her role as an activist educator. She believed she was helping to balance the scales. But in targeting Ethan, she had done what so many before her had done to others, judged someone by appearance rather than effort. And the class saw it. A black student near the front slowly raised his hand and asked, "Professor, Why him? Why make him prove something none of us were asked to? The question hit like a brick. It wasn't confrontational, it was honest. And it echoed the confusion many students felt. If the goal was fairness, why did it feel like this moment had been anything but? Dr. Ellison faltered. Her eyes darted across the classroom, meeting faces that once looked up to her with admiration. Now, they looked at her with a quiet challenge. A mirror had been held up, and for the first time, she didn't like what she saw. Meanwhile, Ethan finished the final step. The solution was elegant. Flawless. The room erupted in hushed awe. But Ethan didn't smile. He didn't bow. He simply turned to the professor, placed the marker gently on her desk, and said, "Sometimes, privilege isn't about where you're from, it's about being given the benefit of the doubt." And with that, the dynamic in the room shifted forever. The silence after Ethan's final words was deafening. He had spoken with no malice, no boastfulness, just clarity. And in doing so, he had peeled back the layers of an uncomfortable truth, that assuming someone's life is easy based on their race or appearance is its own form of discrimination. The message landed differently with everyone in the room, but it landed. And most striking of all was that Ethan didn't want revenge, applause, or even recognition. He wanted understanding. Dr. Karen Ellison stood motionless at the front of the room. Her usual confident posture, shoulders back, chin lifted, had softened. She looked at Ethan as if seeing him for the first time, no longer through the lens of what he represented to her narrative, but for who he truly was, a brilliant, empathetic young man who had just taught her a lesson she never expected to receive, from a student. For a few moments, she said nothing. Then, her eyes dropped to the marker he had placed on her desk, still uncapped. It felt heavy, as though it carried more than ink. She reached for it, paused, then slowly set it down again. Turning to the class, her voice wavered slightly for the first time all semester. "I made a judgment," she said. "Not based on your work, Ethan, but on my assumptions. And I was wrong." A ripple of surprise moved through the classroom. No one expected an apology. But there it was, honest and raw. For many students, especially those who had experienced similar moments of being stereotyped, it was a powerful gesture. Still, others remained skeptical. Was it genuine? Or simply damage control? That's when something unexpected happened. A young Latina student who had been quiet all semester raised her hand. "Professor," she said carefully, "I appreciate what you're trying to teach us about inequality. I've lived it. But, today felt different. Like you were trying to prove a point through Ethan, not with us. That doesn't help anyone." More heads nodded. Another student, a first-generation black college student from Atlanta, spoke next. "Yeah, I've been told I only got in here because of my background, not my ability. That hurts. But if we turn around and make that same assumption about someone else, just because they're white, that's not justice. That's just flipping the bias." It was a moment of reckoning. Not one filled with outrage or yelling, but something far more powerful, collective reflection. Ethan sat quietly through it all, not seeking to be defended. He didn't need to be. The class had taken the conversation beyond him. What had started as an attempt to shame him had become a deep, necessary dialogue about how racial bias can take many forms, and how fighting injustice must be rooted in fairness, not retaliation. For Dr. Ellison, the message was clear. Her role as an educator wasn't to pick targets or craft lessons rooted in assumptions. It was to elevate every voice, without prejudice. That day, her classroom began to transform, not because she had total control, but because she was finally ready to let go of it. By the next morning, the story had already spread beyond the walls of Dr. Ellison's lecture hall. Students shared video clips on campus forums and social media, short, blurry captures of Ethan Marshall solving the impossible equation with calm brilliance, of Dr. Ellison's unexpected apology, and of the students' powerful reflections about bias. But the videos weren't about shaming anyone. They were about something rare in higher education, a genuine, public moment of growth, and the uncomfortable but honest conversation about race, assumptions, and how we all sometimes get it wrong. As the footage circulated, something surprising happened. Students of all backgrounds began chiming in, not just at that university, but across the country. Some shared stories of being dismissed because of the color of their skin. Others spoke of being wrongly assumed to have had an easy life because they were white. For once, people weren't shouting past one another. They were listening. Back in the classroom, a quiet transformation was underway. Dr. Ellison didn't pretend the previous day hadn't happened. Instead, she addressed it openly at the start of class. "I crossed a line," she told her students. "I let my frustration with systemic injustice lead me to judge an individual unfairly. That's not who I want to be as a professor, or as a person. And I hope we can move forward, together." There were no dramatic speeches, no forced reconciliation. Just a moment of mutual understanding. Ethan nodded respectfully, and that was enough. What mattered most was what came next. In the days that followed, the tone of the class shifted. Students who had once felt silenced or typecast began speaking up more, asking questions, sharing their experiences. And surprisingly, Ethan became a source of support, not just academically, but emotionally. Several students, including those who had once misunderstood him, began asking for his help after class. He never brought up what happened. He never needed to. His presence, steady and humble, spoke for itself. Perhaps the most profound change occurred in Dr. Ellison. She began reshaping her curriculum, not by removing discussions of inequality, but by grounding them in respect, dialogue, and the individual stories of her students. She realized that fighting racism and injustice wasn't about placing blame on people who looked a certain way. It was about dismantling assumptions from every angle, including her own. She also began bringing guest speakers to the class, students, professors, and community leaders, who could speak from different perspectives, not to score points, but to build bridges. What happened in that lecture hall didn't undo the long and painful history of racism, nor did it suggest that systemic issues were solved. But it did offer something rare, a moment where people stopped, listened, and chose understanding over outrage. And sometimes, especially in a world quick to divide, that choice can be revolutionary. 1 week later, Dr. Karen Ellison did something no one expected, least of all Ethan Marshall. She asked him to stay after class. As the lecture hall cleared out, she approached him not as an authority figure, but as a colleague in learning. Her voice was quieter than usual, almost hesitant. "Ethan," she began, "I want to ask you something. Would you consider co-teaching a segment of this course with me?" Ethan looked at her, surprised. Not suspicious, just thoughtful. "Co-teach," he repeated. She nodded. "Yes. You'd present alternative solution methods, help lead the practice sessions, and share your approach to problem solving. You've earned the respect of this class, and frankly, I think I could learn from you too." The offer wasn't about handing over power. It was about humility, about acknowledging that learning flows both ways, and that healing from bias requires action, not just apology. And most importantly, it was about rebuilding trust in a space where it had been broken. Ethan agreed, not because he wanted the spotlight, but because he understood the impact it could make. He wasn't interested in fixing Dr. Ellison. He simply wanted to help make the classroom a place where all students, regardless of race, background, or belief, could focus on what brought them there, the pursuit of truth. Word of the collaboration spread quickly, and attendance in Dr. Ellison's class doubled. Students who had never considered taking her course now sat in the lecture hall, curious to witness this unprecedented partnership. And what they saw was something truly rare in higher education, a classroom where intellect and empathy walked side by side. Dr. Ellison taught the theory, grounding students in traditional techniques. Ethan brought it to life, offering streamlined problem-solving methods, referencing historical math texts, and taking the time to mentor struggling students in ways that made them feel seen, not judged. But more than math was being taught. The atmosphere in the room changed. Discussions about inequality, privilege, and bias didn't disappear, but they evolved. Students spoke more freely. They began sharing personal stories, connecting across lines that usually divided them. And through it all, Ethan never preached. He simply modeled what it looked like to live above assumptions. One day, after a particularly engaging session, a student of Asian descent raised her hand. "Professor Ellison," she said, glancing at both her and Ethan, "this is the first time I've felt like I belonged in a math class. Not because I'm good at it, but because I feel respected." That moment struck Dr. Ellison deeply. It was the affirmation she didn't know she needed, and proof that restoring dignity in education requires more than just the right message. It requires the right heart. Their collaboration didn't erase the past. But it offered a new beginning. And for every student watching, it sent a message louder than any lecture: growth is possible, reconciliation is real, and education should be a space where no one, is defined by their race. By the end of the semester, Dr. Ellison's classroom had become something far more powerful than anyone expected. It had become a model for what education could be when people chose understanding over ego, humility over division, and truth over assumptions. The once tense lecture hall now buzzed with curiosity and respect. Students from all backgrounds, black, white, Hispanic, Asian, first-gen, privileged and underprivileged alike, sat side by side, not in silence or suspicion, but in conversation. The legacy of that pivotal day, when Ethan Marshall had been wrongly judged based on his race and presumed privilege, was not forgotten. In fact, it became a cornerstone of how the class moved forward. Each week, students reflected not only on mathematical theory but on their own beliefs, how easily they might have misjudged a peer, or how they themselves had been misjudged. Bias was no longer a word thrown at others, it was a mirror. Dr. Ellison, once seen as rigid and politically motivated, had evolved into a respected figure of balance. She still spoke about inequality in systems of oppression, but she now did so through the lens of inclusion, not accusation. Her lectures didn't ignore the racial complexities of academia, but they no longer singled out individuals. Instead, she asked deeper questions: how do we support each other without assuming each other's stories? How do we fight racism without becoming prejudiced ourselves? Ethan remained a quiet force in the room, never demanding recognition, but always ready to help. He continued mentoring students after class, particularly those who had been marginalized or who lacked confidence in their own abilities. He shared study techniques, broke down complex theories, and, more importantly, listened. For many students of color, his support was not just academic, it was human. They had seen him misjudged and had watched how he responded with grace rather than resentment. That mattered. Outside of class, the story spread across campus as something more than a viral moment. Other professors took notice. Some invited Dr. Ellison and Ethan to speak in their own classrooms. A few faculty members even began re-evaluating their curriculum, realizing that true equity in education meant building classrooms where every student was seen as an individual, not a demographic. Eventually, the university recognized their collaboration formally, establishing a new seminar course titled Bias, Truth, and the Pursuit of Knowledge, co-led by both Dr. Ellison and Ethan. It attracted students from all disciplines and backgrounds, many of whom had once felt invisible in traditional academic spaces. But the most lasting change was quieter. It was in the way students now paused before making assumptions. In the way teachers listened more than they lectured. In the way a classroom once defined by division became a place of unity, not because everyone agreed, but because everyone was finally willing to understand. And at the heart of it all was one powerful truth: you cannot fight racism with more prejudice. But you can overcome it, with humility, honesty, and the courage to see people for who they truly are. This story reminds us of a powerful truth: assumptions are not understanding. Judging someone by how they look, whether we think they've had it easy or hard, only deepens the very divisions we claim to fight. Real progress comes when we listen, when we choose curiosity over criticism, and when we lead with humility. Racism and bias won't be undone by flipping the target. They'll be healed when we see people as individuals, not symbols. Whether in classrooms, workplaces, or even within our families, it's up to each of us to build environments where truth, not prejudice, leads the way. If this story moved you or made you think a little deeper, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Tell me, have you ever been misunderstood or misjudged? Let's talk about it. And if you believe in stories that spark reflection and inspire change, hit that subscribe button and stay with us. This channel is about more than storytelling, it's about connecting through truth.